Well, joining us now for some further insight and analysis of Tuesday's speech from the throne, as well as some of the forthcoming defense policy and procurement challenges facing this new government. Very pleased to welcome to the program Philippe Lagassé, associate professor and Barton chair at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, also co-editor of the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. Professor, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Rob.
Let's start with the throne speech and the fact that King Charles, I guess this will be the third occasion now we've had the monarch actually read the speech from the throne. First of all, just kind of the significance in the ceremony of the throne speech itself, which is a way of kicking off session of parliament, allowing the government to get to work. What is the significance of that, first of all?
So it's important to recognize that, constitutionally speaking, the parliament is composed of the monarch, the Senate, and the House of Commons. We tend to think of Parliament as simply including the two houses of Parliament, but in fact, it does include the Crown. And therefore, the Crown's role in opening Parliament or opening a session of Parliament, in this case, it's a new Parliament, is really indicative of the monarch's continuing role in that institution. And they as well, in line with our constitutional conventions, are there to read out the executive's program for this parliament as well. So in keeping with the Westminster tradition that also links the legislature and the executive, we have, through the person of the monarch in this case, an outline of what the government's plan is for this parliament.
So typically the governor general would read the speech from the throne, but it is of some significance that the king himself is going to be here to read the speech. Now, this is, where there's a bit of a civics lesson, I suppose, for Canadians and understanding the institution of the Canadian monarch. King Charles is the King of Canada. Is there maybe a lack of understanding in this country, do you think, around that?
Yes, I would agree with you. I think to a lot of people, it is the British monarch coming to open the Canadian Parliament, which strikes some people as odd. But to your point, it is a separate office. The King of Canada and the King, as referenced in both the Constitution Act 1867 now and the Constitution Act 1982, is a separate office from the King of the United Kingdom. And indeed, the Canadian government recently altered the Royal Thousand Titles to make that even clearer. Right now, the King's title is simply King of Canada and his other realms. So it is important to note that this is a purely Canadian office, formally speaking. We share it, so we're in a personal union with the United Kingdom and the King's other realms. But he is performing this as the King of Canada, not the King of the United Kingdom.
It's infrequent, as mentioned. I think the last time was, 1977 when the Queen read the speech from the throne. So what is the significance then of having the actual monarch read the speech from the throne?
Well, I think in this particular case, obviously it is responding to questions about our sovereignty and doing so with an individual who the American president is known to admire and respect. And so having the king, who, again, is well respected by President Trump, come and really demonstrate the importance of Canadian sovereignty. And as the personification of that sovereignty, the king, when we talk about a monarch, the other title that they have is the sovereign. And so they are the personification, really, of the Canadian state, still in law. And to have them open this parliament at this moment when there are questions being raised about our future as an independent country, I think is quite significant in that respect.
Is it also a symbol of the past or a symbol of Canada's history, tradition, institutions, and a way of sending a message about what Canada is as a country?
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, it's important to recognize that our institutions date back 1,000 years, and we inherited them from the United Kingdom, and we've made them our own. But it is also highlighting that the institutions that we have been around for centuries, and we have adapted them. We've changed them to meet our needs and our ambitions, but they are enduring, and they will endure into the future. So it is making this case that we're dealing with institutions that have lived through a wide arc of history and have been through lots of different changes, but that doesn't deny their importance. And I think equally important to highlight that our system of government is different from the American one and that we have our own pride in it.
And I mean, there is division in Canada around the institution, and then maybe to some extent, we have King Charles, who maybe Canadians aren't quite as fond of as maybe they were of the Queen. And by inviting him here, I guess that does open that debate. I mean, I don't know that we need to necessarily shy away from the debate, but what are some of the realities that need to shape that conversation, do you think?
Well, I think the key thing for me is those who would want us to move away from the crown as kind of the core foundation of our state would need to come up with some kind of plausible alternative that we can all agree on. And in the absence of that, the reality is that unless you have some kind of alternative that you can rally Canadians around, well, this is the Constitution that we have, and why we should probably learn to work with it and better understand it than to simply grasp at some ephemeral idea of some alternative. And as we've seen in other countries, such as Australia, who have contemplated moving away from constitutional monarchy, it's pretty difficult to come up with something everybody can agree with about what would replace it. And in the Canadian case in particular, we might think of some of the foundational pieces of our country, such as the treaties that exist between the Crown and First Nations, would need to be understood as part of some alternative, and that you would want and need to get the agreement of those First Nations who have a treaty relationship with the Crown before you move ahead.
Is there something to be said then for that stability, that longevity, that tradition, right? Is there a strong case to be made for this system as it is?
I would agree. I would say so. I mean, again, this is a system that has endured many different monarchs over several centuries. It's endured a civil war in England, been restored, undergone a glorious revolution in 1689 that made the crown subject to the will of Parliament. In our case now, it was originally Canada being confederated under the crown of the United Kingdom, and eventually we secured our sovereignty and autonomy and independence through an independent Canadian crown. And that crown is now part of the Constitution of Canada as the highest law. So it's an enduring system, one that has met our purposes, and one that really reflects what I would argue is a state of many nations. And when you have a state of many nations, it becomes more difficult to say that sovereignty should reside in the people, particularly because we would have difficulties in some cases defining what that is. It is an institution that's bound lots of different nations under a single state, and it's been quite successful in doing so.
Now, as to who is or should be the monarch, and you alluded to some changes we made recently that's kind of spelled that out because, we know where King Charles lives. He's going to come here and he's going to speak and he's going to have an accent that reminds us of all of that. The idea maybe that if we're going to have a king or queen of Canada, that person could or should be Canadian. What about that challenge?
Well, I would argue that one of the great benefits that we've had is that the monarch is not resident. We get a lot of benefits for a very little cost. A
Yeah.
lot of people criticize the cost of the royals in the United Kingdom. I mean, the reality is it's largely self-funded. I mean, that's kind of not well understood in the UK either. But the reality is Canadians have a monarch that they pay very little for. It costs about $1 or maybe $1.25 to maintain the vice-regal offices in Canada per person. And we get quite a bit of benefit of both a hereditary system that acts as the ultimate fire extinguisher, but also appointees that both in the provinces and at the federal level that can fulfill a lot of the head of state functions. And perhaps even more importantly, as we're seeing when we look at the United States, the importance that we have in our system of having a clear demarcation between the head of state function and the head of government function. It's important in our system to know that there's always two people ahead or above the prime minister. There's the governor general, and then there's the monarch. And at a time when people have questions around power and how it's being used, I think it's an inherent virtue of our system that there is that clear demarcation between those who rule and those who reign.
So let's talk about some of the challenges now facing this government. The speech from the throne will be read. They'll get on with the business of governing. I mean, focusing on the economy, these issues are at the forefront. But when it comes to defense policy and procurement, there's some big challenges facing this government. Obviously, a commitment that we're going to get to 2% of GDP being spent on defense as per our NATO commitments. we got fighter jets, shipbuilding. There's some big procurement challenges. What stand out to you, first of all, in terms of the biggest challenges or priorities facing this government on this front?
So as you alluded to, we're trying to get to 2% of defense spending as a portion of GDP by 2030. And one of the biggest challenges the government's going to face is just finding a way to spend that money wisely and smartly. Um, the fact of the matter is that even though the federal government has grown quite considerably over the past decade, you don't necessarily have more capacity in terms of defense procurement. So you have a number of people already trying to move a lot of program through the system. And unless the defense procurement system is greatly simplified and you also expand the number of people that are working on that file, as counterintuitive as it may seem, you're going to have difficulty really spending that money and, as importantly, spending it smartly, which I think is going to be the other big challenge. That being said,
Right.
there are a number of projects that the previous government of Justin Trudeau and now Mr. Carney's government have already kind of intimated that they're going to move ahead with, such as submarines, early airborne warning aircraft, and other things. So there's a number of low-hanging fruit there that they can move on. But I would say the biggest challenge is going to be, how do we do procurement of new types of systems in a way that is different from what we've done it in the past? And I'm thinking in particular of small autonomous systems that you cycle through at a very high pace that are very different from how you buy those than buying big warships, for instance. So our system is really made to buy these very long-term procurements of very big things, and not so well suited to doing rapid procurements of very exhaustible assets.
Well, how much just does maybe foreign policy and almost industrial policy creep into this? The idea that maybe we can build some of this ourselves, and then that's, creates jobs, and there's that spin-off, and also the question of, from whom do we purchase these things, and our relationships, like with the Americans most obviously, but Europeans, or maybe even South Korea in the case of submarines. How does that all factor in?
So you're right. I mean, a lot of the equipment that we've been buying since 2017 has been American. And I suspect that the government's going to be under a good deal of pressure from Canadians not to continue down that preferential road when it comes to American technology. Which isn't to say that we're not going to do so when it suits our interests, but there is going to be interest in building new partnerships. You've mentioned some of the possibilities that are out there. A conventional submarine, for instance, is not a product that the Americans sell. So we would either get it from Germany or Sweden or South Korea, for instance. Similarly, the government has promised to buy the airborne early warning aircraft from a domestic manufacturer. So that seems to indicate Bombardier, that has built that kind of platform in the past for other countries. But to your other point, when it comes to a lot of these small systems, so autonomous air systems, so drones, or autonomous underwater systems, we probably should be emphasizing Canadian producers of that. These are systems that we have the knowledge and have the know-how and have the manufacturing capacity to build. And so we should really be building Canadian capacity in that regard. By the same token, the war in Ukraine has really exposed the need to develop far greater capacity in terms of munitions. And that could be an area where Canada could stand out as a champion within the NATO alliance generally. We should become a munitions powerhouse and really be able to supply our allies. That's another opportunity where, if the government is smart, they could really leverage a lot of our capacity. And a lot of that manufacturing capacity, I would even note, may come under a lot of pressure as part of the trade war with the United States. So we may have some excess manufacturing that we could redirect towards some of these defense goals.
We talk about fighter jets specifically, and what a mess this has been, right? As it took a long time to decide on the F-35s, then we changed our mind, and then we came back to the F-35s, and I guess we're at the starting point of filling that contract. But now questions, maybe we should also go with some other fighter jets because of some of these challenges with the U.S. So where are things at, first of all, with fighter jets, and what can we learn from how we've gone about that?
So to your point, it took us quite a bit of time to land on the F-35, over a decade. Number of different studies, lots of different evaluations, and then a fair and open, transparent competition to finally arrive at that. Right now, we're contracted to buy an initial 16, but we have 88 is the objective for the F-35. it's equally important to note that we're not just buying the planes, we're also buying a lot of training infrastructure, general operating infrastructure, munitions. So you can't really only buy 16 given everything else that you're putting in place to absorb that fleet. And similarly, the CF-18s are very much at the end of their life. So they're on life support, really. Were you to simply pause the F-35 purchase right now, you would risk not having any fighter capability for the next little while if you're not careful. So as a number of people have suggested, the alternative would not so much be abandoning the F-35 as potentially complementing it with another European fighter. And that's a possibility. There are a number of existing European fighter aircraft that are available, the Rafale, the Eurofighter, and the Gripen. Another possibility that's been floated is not buying the existing European aircraft, but partnering with European and Asian allies to develop a sixth generation aircraft, which they're already doing. So, for instance, the UK and Japan and Italy are working on something called the Tempest. So perhaps Canada gets on board with that and complements its F-35 fleet with another generation later.
And then at the same time, maybe there's further integration happening with the US and the possibility of a new missile defense system that Canada might be a part of. Now, maybe this does expand off what exists with NORAD, but this is also something very new and very different. And by the way, I mean, if we're going to spend money on that, is that spending that would count toward our 2% target?
To your point, we still already do a bit of missile defense in North America through NORAD. So we deal with cruise missiles through the existing arrangements, so what are called air-breathing threats. So anything that's got a jet engine on it, whether it's a missile or a plane, NORAD already deals with that. NORAD also already does early warning of ballistic missile launches. So if we were to expand our role in that, it would be a continuation of what we've already been doing with NORAD. And similarly, I think the Carney government is open to this simply because, as they've expressed, if you're going to defend Canadian airspace, you should probably have a say in that. So if this Golden Dome, whatever it looks like, ends up intercepting missiles headed for Canada, we should probably be in the room. Some people will question why we're doing that because we've declared that we want to be less integrated with the United States. I think the reality check to all that is that we will always defend the continent alongside the United States. The depth of that cooperation will vary, and as the Prime Minister said, we'll do it on a case-by-case basis. But that spending and that effort is going to definitely count towards our 2%. And I think we should all just take a pause here and see what it ends up looking like and what is actually asked of Canada. And the government's going to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, this was a huge issue in the 80s. I mean, even 20 years ago, this came up and was controversial. Is it a little bit different now, do you think?
I would argue that things have changed since these initial debates. The reality is Canada supports ballistic missile defense for NATO, and yet it doesn't support it for itself. So we've been in this very odd kind of strange, ambiguous relationship with this technology where we think it's great for our allies, and yet we've hesitated to do it for ourselves. So finally coming to grips with ballistic missile defense would be reconciling our different policy positions on this. By the same token, the threat has increased, and we have to recognize that there is a greater ballistic missile threat to North America, notably even from North Korea and eventually from Iran. So we have to be cognizant of that, and we don't want to be held hostage by these potential launches. So I think the debate has moved on. I think it's going to be more a question of how deeply integrated we want to be with the United States, not necessarily a debate over ballistic missile defense per se.
Well, some important consequential decisions lie ahead for this government for sure. We'll leave it there. Professor, like I say, again, appreciate your insight on all of this. Thank you so much for making some time for us here today.
Thanks, Rob.